All right, well, it's great to be with you, and thank you for, we used to say, coming across the street. With the new landscaping, we don't have a street to cross anymore, but it still can be, at times, a large psychological distance from main campus and the law school. Part of that is because, unlike the business school, for example, we're exclusively focused on the teaching of graduate students. And so we're not familiar with you, and we are grateful to have this opportunity for outreach of trying to help familiarize you with the study of law, the practice of law, and in particular opportunities that may draw you to this law school. What I want to do today is talk about opportunities relating to law and religion, particularly here at BYU. And I'm going to focus on three general topics, and my plan is to speak for about 30 minutes and then leave about 15 minutes open for questions and answers. But I'd also be pleased if you feel inclined to interrupt and ask a question anywhere along the way that you feel comfortable asking. I know that's a little bit hard when there's a PowerPoint presentation going on. It can create a little bit of a barrier to participation, and I'll understand that as well. But if you do have questions, feel free to interject them along the way. This is really designed to be primarily an informational opportunity. What I want to do is I want to talk about three general topics. The first has to do with learning, the second with advocacy, and the third with the international opportunities relating to law and religion here at BYU Law School. Starting with learning, there are a number of courses that we offer here at the law school. We have perhaps the largest number of faculty at any law school in the country who are interested in law and religion issues. We teach courses on the international protection of religious liberty, on church and state in the United States. We also teach regularly a law and religion colloquium, which brings in about a dozen scholars from other universities who are working on law and religion papers, and they present their works in progress to our students. And the students question and critique them on their ongoing work. We also have courses on international and comparative law and religion, comparative constitutional law, perspectives on contemporary legal theory, and other courses on law and religion in the United States. We actually offer a couple different courses there. So in terms of your ability to come and be exposed to a rich curriculum, I think we are probably second to none. This is the cover of a case book that my colleague Cole Durham and I have written on law and religion. It's the leading case book in the country that looks at law and religion from an international and comparative as well as U.S. perspective. The reason I mention this is because there's actually quite a lot of opportunity for student involvement as we have a major web supplement that we keep up to date. And we are working on a new edition of this case book right now. And we have students who are former students in our class who are involved in keeping the web supplement up to date and also in working on this new edition of the case book. The book has also been translated into Chinese, Vietnamese, and is in the process of being translated into Turkish. And we have summer training programs in religion and the rule of law, both in China and in Vietnam, that we involve students in participating in helping with the organization and management of those summer training programs. Those are 2-week intensive programs that train law professors and judges from these other countries on law and religion issues. What I wanted to do is spend a few minutes talking about the state of religious freedom around the world. This is a modified version of what you might hear in an introductory lecture on our class on international protection of religious freedom. There's important social science research which is being conducted about the status of religious freedom around the world. And a series of studies have been done over the last 7 years by the Pew Research Center's Religion and Public Life Project. And it estimates that at the end of the year 2012, 76% of the world's people were living under conditions of high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. And I'll go into this data in a little bit more detail, but the trend line is also distressing because this is an increase from 68% in 2007. And so in the last 7 years or so, there's been a significant increase. One of the things we do at the center is we have a headline service where we send out an email alert daily to about 2,500 subscribers about headlines around the world, focusing on Europe and focusing on the U.S., about law and religion matters. And these are the headlines from yesterday. So this is not over the last 6 months. These are headlines that occurred yesterday relating to religious freedom issues around the world. There's an article about Islamophobia from a Turkish research institute, a report from the Pew Forum that religious hostilities in China have increased fourfold over the last decade. A report out of Israel about the rising phenomenon of internet anti-Semitism, terrible religious violence in Myanmar. I was in Burma just in October at a conference on the rule of law, and there is a small Muslim minority that's being persecuted and even people being killed by the Buddhist majority there I should say, a very small fringe of the Buddhist majority in Myanmar. A British man was sentenced to death for blasphemy in Pakistan. This is an elderly British gentleman who's been living in Pakistan for years and has been involved in some Christian proselytizing. North Korea remains the #1 persecutor of Christians. You've probably seen headlines of foreign Christian missionaries, I believe from Australia, that are imprisoned in North Korea at the moment. A Thai Buddhist monk vows to fight on even as protesters scale back. Ukrainian churches concerned about the military involvement of Russia in Ukraine. An article about upcoming Indian elections and the legacy of religious violence looming. The King of Belgium signing a bill providing for children's euthanasia. And in the Central African Republic, really savage sectarian violence between Christians and Muslims that seems to be in a state of reprisal and counter-reprisal that brings back memories of Rwanda. This is just yesterday, so you get a sense that, and it's only a subset of what was yesterday. There were probably about 60 headlines in yesterday's news feed, and here are a few relating to international issues. In the Pew research, they look at two different types of restrictions on religious freedom. They look on legal restrictions and then what they call social hostilities or social restrictions on religion. And this chart documents their research over the last 7 years, focusing on the overall, the combined restrictions of legal and social together. And when they look at the number of countries in the world where there are high levels of restrictions on religion, you can see that number has gone from a little less than 30% to a little bit more than 40%. And the countries where it is either high or very high based on global population, the numbers are even higher, moving from 68% to 76%. Now, the reason for the differentiation between the number of countries and the population is that China and India, as well as Indonesia, large population countries, are included on these high restriction categories. What's interesting about India is the legal restrictions on religion are only moderate. but the social hostilities are very high, whereas in China you have the opposite phenomenon. Social hostilities, while evidently rising, are relatively low, but the legal restrictions are quite high. And so it really creates a different set of problems in a way, depending on whether what you're dealing with is primarily legal restrictions or primarily social hostilities. This is a chart that focuses on the overall restrictions based over the period of time. What is important to notice here is the top red bar is getting bigger, and combined with the moderate bar, it's getting larger. So this is another way of visualizing the trends with respect to religious freedom. And this is the same sort of bar graph that focuses on population. You can see that the number of people around the world living with high levels of restriction is probably over 5 billion people. So the large majority of people in the world are living in places where restrictions on religious freedom are either high or very high. This is another map that shows geographically how this is distributed. The light green on this map are the countries with low levels of government restrictions on religion. The green indicates more moderate levels of restriction. And you can see that most of North and South America, large parts of Africa and Europe, Australia, a few other places around the world have low or moderate restrictions. When we add in the high restrictions, we get a different geography coming in, largely northern Africa, moving into the Middle East, over towards Southeast Asia. When we add in the countries with very high restrictions, we can see that this brings in other parts of Asia, other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And so we can get a sense that the significant issues with respect to religious freedom are global, to be sure, but to some large extent focused in particular on Asia, Southeast Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. And that probably tracks your intuitions to some significant extent because the types of restrictions, the types of hostilities that you hear about in the headlines are the types of things that are reflected in this data. This chart is focusing specifically on legal restrictions. Now I'm going to show you a separate map which is focusing on social hostilities. Here you can see much of the same areas of the world, perhaps a few more countries where the social hostilities are not high. If we add in the high, we see, interestingly, more countries in Europe have social hostilities, problems with social restrictions on religious freedom than legal restrictions, and we see something similar in Mexico and in certain parts of Africa. The countries with very high social hostilities are again largely in Asia and in Middle East and in North Africa. You'll notice here that China is not in the very high, whereas India is, which is a reversal of what we saw with respect to the legal restrictions. This chart is interesting because it takes the 25 most populous countries and it looks at the government restrictions index cumulatively over the last 4 reports that the Pew Report has put together. And there are a couple of things that are interesting about this. One thing we notice is that the United States does not appear at the top of the list of countries with very low restrictions. The United States is at the bottom of the moderate category, but has been increasing. Social and legal restrictions with respect to religion in the United States both seem to be on the increase. Another thing that's interesting about this is if we look at the countries with very high restrictions, we tend to think of this largely as an issue relating to Islam, but there are different ways that we can get restrictions. Sometimes they come from religious majorities. So in many countries with large Islamic majorities, we find high levels of restriction on religion. But we also find it in countries with other significant majorities, Buddhists in Myanmar, for example, or Orthodox Christians in places like Greece and Russia. And we can also see it in places where there are official ideologies of state atheism. This tends to result in relatively high restrictions. We see this, for example, in Vietnam. We see it in Russia as well. It's interesting, though, to note that there are a lot of countries that we think of as progressive Western democracies with good rule of law and human rights records that show up as well. I think noteworthy here is France, the United Kingdom, which has rising tides of religious hostility as well. So again, I think this mapping is interesting in thinking about the varied causes and the varied places where religious freedom is a significant issue. Here in the United States, there are a lot of issues as well. I'll talk in detail about one of them in just a minute. But here are the headlines from yesterday relating to law and religion issues in the United States. The German homeschoolers can stay in the United States after all. This was an Immigration Service ruling after the U.S. Supreme Court denied certification in the German homeschoolers case. There's another case making its way through the Colorado courts involving a Christian baker who declined to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. The American atheist lawsuit against the World Trade Center. The top right-hand photo there is the World Trade Center cross. This was just debris, rubble from the collapse of the Trade Center that was left in the shape of a cross and was preserved, and now there is a lawsuit challenging the inclusion of that as part of the memorial for the 9/11 site. Headline that Disney had cut funding to the Boy Scouts over their ban on gay adult leaders. Questions about the Little Sisters of the Poor and their lawsuit involving the HHS contraception mandate. Headlines about the Hobby Lobby case, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and a new survey revealing that the majority of Americans believe religious liberty is declining in the United States. Again, this is just about a third of the headlines that we gathered for yesterday, so it's certainly a topic that is of interest in the press and in our general culture. Let me talk for a little bit about the opportunities for advocacy that are here at BYU Law School. This is on my mind because in the last month I've had student help on 2 briefs that we filed that I've been involved with. One on the Hobby Lobby case where our center was asked by the Beckett Fund, the lawyers for Hobby Lobby, to put a brief in support of Hobby Lobby based on international and comparative law materials. And I'll talk a little bit about that brief in a minute. And then we've, over the last few years, had center briefs in some other Supreme Court cases. I was also involved with students on another brief in the Kitchen case, which is the Utah same-sex marriage case, arguing. We got a group of scholars, some in favor of same-sex marriage, some opposed to same-sex marriage, but all of whom argued that the Supreme Court's use of animus as the primary rationale in the Windsor case, which was the DOMA case, the federal law defining marriages between one man and one woman, the court there used animus to characterize those who had favored the Defense of Marriage Act, and our brief was arguing that animus is the wrong way of addressing this issue. So think with me about recent headlines. About 2 weeks ago, CVS, the largest pharmacy chain in the United States, announced that they were going to stop selling cigarette and tobacco products by October of this year. This was a significant announcement because selling cigarettes is big business for Walgreens and CVS. And basically what he said is that the company had come to believe there was something incongruous and wrong about being a health store that is a drugstore devoted to trying to help people get healthy, stay healthy, be healthy, selling cigarettes, which are well known to cause a lot of health problems. And this was a courageous thing for them to do, because if you think about it, this is going to have several implications. One implication it's going to have is that Hobby Lobby is going to be less profitable, or CVS rather is going to be less profitable. There are millions and millions of dollars of revenue that come from selling cigarettes. And so we can imagine that shareholders might be unhappy. One of the courses I teach is business associations. The basic theory of a corporation is that it exists to make money for shareholders, and the management's job is to make decisions that are going to maximize profits for shareholders. It's also significant because it might be bad for employees. If sales go down at CVS, the number of people employed at the stores will go down. And it's also inconvenient for customers. This imposes a real hardship on people who want to buy legal products conveniently. And there are places where it's going to be more difficult, perhaps more expensive for people to buy tobacco products. Now, in spite of all of those reasons, the reaction was one of commendation, generally in the press, and particularly from the Obama administration. Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, issued an immediate press release applauding the CVS Corporation for their leadership in helping to make the next generation tobacco-free. The announcement they will no longer sell products is an unprecedented step. We commend them for their cessation program. This will have considerable impact. I hope others will follow their lead. And so what we see is a response which is really quite supportive of the idea that CVS would be putting principle ahead of profits, would be putting conscience-based concerns, I was trying to say conscientious concerns, ahead of the almighty dollar. And I think appropriately so. I think it is remarkable and commendable that CVS would take a step like this. And there are a lot of other companies that we praise for their good works, for deciding to pursue important social values other than making money. I noticed, for example, during the Super Bowl, there was a commercial, Coca-Cola, and it turns out that Coca-Cola raises and spends millions of dollars protecting Arctic wildlife, polar bears and other animal life. Think of Patagonia. Patagonia is quite careful in the way they source their materials. If you look at their website, if you look at their brochures, if you look at their catalogs, There are articles about how they source their down in ways that are more protective of animal life, of geese, than their competitors. And the idea is you should buy Patagonia and be willing to pay a little bit more for Patagonia, because this is a company that has a social conscience, that cares about doing business in a socially responsible way. And again, I think that is to their credit. This is a premium brand, and I buy and enjoy Patagonia products myself. Here's Ben & Jerry's. You can see the Occupy Wall Street cows marching on Washington. Ben & Jerry's famously spends quite a lot of their money on social justice causes, and is quite scrupulous in the way they employ fair trade principles in the sourcing of the milk and cream and chocolate and other ingredients that go into the making of their ice cream. And so when you sit down with your pint of Ben & Jerry's on the couch, you can feel good about yourself because you are acting in a socially responsible way in eating that ice cream. Similarly, the Body Shop has had a long-standing commitment to being careful with animal testing and animal-based products in their cosmetics. What I find interesting is the contrast, because with the Green family, we have a Christian family from Oklahoma, starting out with one craft store, developing into a company with more than 600 stores in 4,700 states, I think about 13,000 employees, employees whose starting salary is about $13 or $14 an hour, far above the minimum wage. We're debating about whether to raise it to $10.10 from $7-something. So this is a company that says that it wants to provide a living wage for its employees, has a self-funded insurance plan which is more comprehensive than most insurance plans and covers a larger range of employees than most insurance plans. Now, one of the things that the Affordable Care Act did is it required all companies that employ more than 50 people to provide various contraceptives and abortifacient drugs. Abortifacient drugs are drugs that are alleged, there's some debate about how they work, and it's difficult to get unbiased scientific information because it's such a fraught area of public disagreement. But the concern is that after fertilization but before implantation, the fetus, it's not quite a fetus yet, but the fertilized egg is destroyed. And on certain Christian, Catholic certainly, some other conservative Christian conceptions of life, life begins at contraception, and so anything done after the moment of contraception is akin to murder and is a morally serious act of violence against human life. The Greens are not Catholic. They're conservative Protestants. I think they're Pentecostal, and they don't have an objection to contraception, but they do have an objection to abortifacients and sterilization. And they sought and were refused an exemption from the health care law, and they sued, and their lawsuit is now before the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that it violates the religious freedom of the Greens and their company, Hobby Lobby, to be forced against their religious scruples to provide the abortifacient drugs. So our center was asked to file a brief on behalf of Hobby Lobby, focusing on the international and comparative dimensions of this, as well as the idea of whether or not it makes sense for a corporation to have a conscience. The headline that you often see is something like, I remember reading an op-ed of the headline, it said, "Religious freedom is for people, not corporations." And that kind of makes sense. I mean, we don't really think of a corporation necessarily as a place where religion is practiced. We think of religious freedom as being something that's important to individuals, but is it also important to businesses? Well, as we think about CVS and Coca-Cola and Patagonia, we do notice that they are encouraged to act on the basis of conscience. And so there is a large movement. Any of you who are in the business school will have heard a lot about social responsibility, the UN Global Compact, efforts to get companies to be sensitive to communities other than shareholders, to stakeholders other than shareholders, to employees, to customers, to the communities in which they do business, to the environment. And so there is a strong emphasis on businesses acting in ways that are consonant with conscience-based concerns. And yet there seems to be something quite different when the conscience is religiously motivated rather than motivated by more secular concerns. And so, for example, Kathleen Sebelius is the person on the opposite side of this case. The person who is praising CVS for being conscientious is arguing that corporations are just for making money, and they have no business transporting religious values from the owners into the actual business. And it's surprising to me that there seems to be relatively little appreciation of the irony. That on the one hand, we are praising businesses for acting in ways that are conscience-based, and on the other, we are suing them for or refusing to give them space for pursuing their conscience in this area. When it comes time for doing a Supreme Court brief, it's sort of an all-hands-on-deck type situation. They tend to come up with very short time frames and severe deadlines. This is a group of students that were working on another one of the earlier Supreme Court briefs a year or two ago. With respect to the Hobby Lobby case, there are really three important doctrinal issues that the Supreme Court will be deciding. The first is whether Hobby Lobby is a person with free exercise rights. This is the topic I've been raising with you about whether a corporation can have a conscience or not. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is the statute that applies here, says that the government cannot substantially burden religious exercise of any person unless there's a compelling state interest, and there are no less restrictive means for doing that. And so the question, one of the questions, is whether Hobby Lobby counts as a person under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's not defined, and it's an issue that hasn't been decided before. And then the issue is, well, what about a for-profit corporation? Because we might say, well, maybe a non-profit corporation, say BYU, is a person for purposes of religious freedom, but not a for-profit corporation. So those are two issues that will need to be decided. One of the important precedents involves free speech, the Citizens United case, where corporations were held to be persons with respect to free speech. But people on the political left tend to be quite critical of that decision and want it to be reversed. And so one way of viewing the fight here is a struggle over campaign finance, because if a corporation is not a person with respect to free exercise, then we might think the court would be more willing to revisit the question of whether a corporation is a person with respect to free speech. These are both rights that are found in the First Amendment. The second question then becomes whether there's a compelling state interest to require all employers to provide contraception. One thing to notice is there are a lot of employers who don't have to provide contraception. In fact, 90% of all employers in the United States employ less than 50 people. And so they're not subject to the Obamacare requirements. So Hobby Lobby is arguing there's not a compelling interest when 90% of all businesses are not subject to this requirement. It's not 90% of all employees, it's about 50% of all employees, because big companies employ a lot of people, and so about half of Americans work for companies that are covered by the Affordable Care Act, and about half don't. The other thing that makes it interesting is that in a way this can be viewed as a way of cost shifting the expense of contraception from the government to business. And this also raises the question of whether it's really a compelling state interest when it looks like it's a government interest in shifting who pays rather than whether contraception is going to be available. After all, there's been public funding. There are public clinics that make contraception available. They've been around for a long time. And it seems that there may be other less restrictive means of accomplishing this end. We could give a tax credit to women who work for employers who claim this conscientious exemption. We could provide them a voucher that they could use and take to the drugstore and get the drugs. Or we could reimburse pharmacies when they receive a certification from a customer that she is working for an employer that doesn't provide it. So I think there are strong arguments that it is not the least restrictive means. But in a way, the deep question is corporate conscience and the question of whether we want corporations to be entities that take values into account other than profit maximization. And we need to think carefully about whether religious conscience should be treated as sort of a suspect classification. Well, let me spend just 2 or 3 minutes talking about the center and some of the opportunities available to students at the center. The mission and purpose of the center at BYU Law School is to help secure the blessings of freedom of religion for all people everywhere. It's an audacious mission, but we focus on 3 specific areas, all having to do with the fact that we are a law school attached to a university. We seek to expand and disseminate knowledge and expertise, to facilitate the growth of networks and scholars, and to contribute to law reform efforts. Student involvement really takes 3 different forms. One is we have a large annual law and religion symposium that brings about 75 scholars from 40 countries to the law school, and it's basically student run, and so the students are very involved in running that symposium. We also have summer fellows and a student management board. Here you can see students involved in the Law and Religion Symposium. This is really quite a unique opportunity to bring leading law and religion people from around the world to BYU. We just had our 20th annual conference this past October. This fall we'll be having our 21st. It involves a lot of activities with the delegates who come to the conference. Here you can see the delegate photo. We take them up to Salt Lake and they go to a session of general conference on Sunday morning. They also take a tour of Temple Square and the Humanitarian Center. And the capstone of the event is a lunch hosted by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. That is an opportunity as well. So that's number one. Number two is the summer fellows. Each year, the law school selects 14 to 20 students who spend half of the summer in an international externship and half of the summer doing research at the center on some of our academic and advocacy projects. Over the last 4 years, these are the countries that our summer fellows have gone to. Typically, they go work for either the area legal council of the church. The church's legal office is divided into regions of the world, and many of these are places where there are headquarters of a area. And others go work for the lawyers who the church employs in other countries. If we don't have an office in a country, almost surely there has been a law firm that has been asked to do legal work for the church, and those law firms are eager to receive our students who will go and work And this work is done for credit. So the internship, we aren't able to pay you because there's rules that you can't be paid at the same time you're receiving credit. But for the other part of the summer, students come and work at the center, and for the work at the center, they do get paid for that, although only about what Hobby Lobby pays. It's not a good way of getting rich. But here are photos of individuals over the last summer or so that have gone and worked in various international externships as part of the summer program. Then the summer fellows, you can look at our website today, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, and you'll see the biographies of the students who have been just announced and selected as summer fellows for next year. And then the other part of the summer, as I said, they come and work at the center. The center also maintains 3 websites, and students help keep those up to date and working during the summer activities as well. One is called the Law and Religion Consortium. One is the Strasbourg Consortium, which focuses on the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. There's also the Headline Service, and then our center website, which in addition, the third opportunity is we have a student management board. This creates a possibility for continuing involvement for second and third year students. This is a new innovation that we have at the center. Each of the members of the management board is given responsibility for an area of the world where we hold annual regional conferences. And the idea is that these students will then help us plan and then go with us to help execute those regional conferences. And so, for example, this year we'll be having conferences where we take students to participate in South Africa, Vietnam, Poland, China, UK, Guatemala, India, and Italy. There are a couple others that we'll probably be able to involve students in as well, but those are the ones that we have students who are on the management board who are participating. So the regional conferences in 2014 will be in those countries that I just mentioned. I just wanted to end with a pitch that it's actually a really good time to attend law school. There's a lot of negativity about legal education and the legal profession in the press. Applications are down. They're down about 40% since 2007, which means it's a lot easier to get admitted to law school today than it was 5 years ago. In addition to that, the job market is really turning around. The number of jobs available this year for the first time in 7 years is equal to the number of students who are graduating from law school. There's a little bit of a backlog in the system. The work you have to do to get the job you want is more now than it was a decade ago, but it really is, I think, the corner has been turned, and in 3 years, 4 years, when you'd be finishing law school, I hope the job market will be significantly better. Another question that comes up a lot is, is it okay to go to the same school for your bachelor's and your professional degree? And the answer depends on what field you're in. If you're in the humanities or the sciences, it's quite important to go to a different school because it's the same faculty that teaches undergraduates and graduates, and you get exposed to a new group of faculty, a new way of thinking by changing. With professional schools, it doesn't work quite that way. And all of your professors now are in departments where it makes sense to go to someplace different. So the counsel they will give you based upon their disciplines is that you should go someplace different. But in professional schools, it would be the same for the business. It would really be the same for medicine. It would be the same certainly for law, especially in schools where there's no undergraduate teaching taking place. You don't have the same issues come up. And indeed, we've never had employers seem to discriminate against students who have 2 degrees from the same school. So I don't think that's a very significant consideration. Also, the intellectual climate and the purpose of the law school is quite different than the intellectual climate and the purpose of the undergraduate university, for good reason. And so the type of inquiry we make here is really the same as the type of inquiry that's made at every law school. Our goal, because we try to keep our tuition reasonable, is to empower students to pursue their career objectives. So you can come, get the education you want, and then pursue the type of job you want without feeling that because of the debt that you have, that there's only one possible way you can go. I've talked a little too long, but let me end there and open the floor for questions, and I can also stay and answer questions. But if anyone needs to leave, feel free to shuffle out now. Any questions?